All right, so this is part two. We're looking at chapter 6, which is more criminal defenses. Obviously, you can see drugs and alcohol on here, and yeah, we're going to be talking about that stuff. So, just important, I noticed I highlighted it. The use of drugs or controlled substances, dependence on drugs or controlled substances, or voluntary intoxication shall not, as such, constitute a defense to a criminal charge. We're going to talk about that. So, first thing we're going to talk about, and I will tell you right now, the second case study response for this week is going to be looking at an insanity defense. Okay, so this is something that is fairly heavy content and a lot. So bear with me. That's part of the reason why I said we'll break it up into two videos. Okay. So as we said before, the exception of an alibi and the expiration of a statute of limitations, explored criminal defenses are based on justification. So all the previous ones were based off of some kind of excuse, or sorry, wow. With the exception of alibi and expiration of the statute of limitations, everything that we've looked at in the first part was justification. Justifying the action, saying that, well, the crime wasn't really that bad. This part is looking at excuses. These are things that look at the individual and say why they shouldn't be criminally charged. And so when we talk about that, the first one everyone thinks of because, well, it's been used in media for years and we can't help it, the insanity defense. So remember, defenses based on excuses focus on the defendant and that they shouldn't be held responsible, not on the action itself. So, although controversial, most states and the federal government recognize the insanity defense. Oddly enough, Montana, Utah, Kansas, and Idaho are the only states that do not. Montana, Utah, and Kansas kind of make sense to me. Montana and Utah are both very isolated communities. They also have a lot of traditional views. Kansas is very middle of the country, middle of nowhere kind of thing. Idaho is close, but anyway, most states recognize the insanity defense. The insanity defense is the subject of much debate because it can and does excuse the most evil and aberrant, abhorrent conduct. And in many jurisdictions, legal insanity functions as a perfect defense. It results in acquittal. However, the insanity defense is rarely used and hardly ever successful. This is generally because of the difficulty in proving legal insanity, and that's important. We're not talking medical insanity. We're talking legal insanity. There is a difference. And look at that next thing I highlighted. Legal insanity differs from medical insanity and is generally much more difficult to establish. So this whole first part of the chapter we're looking at is just on the insanity defense. So, bear with me. This might be the part of the video and part of the lecture that you focus on when you're looking at your case study response number 7, I believe. It's the second one of this week. So the policy supporting insanity defense is twofold, and we'll talk about that here in a second because I totally just passed. While the purpose of a medical diagnosis is to eventually cure the defendant's disorder, the purpose of a criminal law is to punish the defendant. And so that's important to remember. Medical insanity, we want medical diagnosis is to cure. Legal insanity, the point is to punish. So we'll get into that. So twofold policy for supporting the insanity defense. Number one, first, an insane defendant does not have control over their conduct. This is similar to defendant who is hypnotized and sleepwalking, that kind of thing. They do not have physical control over their actions. Second, an insane defendant does not have the ability to form criminal intent. Remember, elements of crime, you need the criminal act, the criminal intent, and a connection of the two, a convergence of the two. You need a correspondence of the two. Notice I'm saying a bunch of C words. I'm reminding you. If you cannot form criminal intent without the ability to control conduct or the understanding that conduct is evil or wrong, an insane defendant will commit crimes again and again. Thus, no deterrent or effect is served by punishment, and treatment is appropriate. This is why we see that, technically speaking, if someone is successful, and it comes up later, if someone successfully proves the insanity defense, they don't just get released into society. They are put in a specialized facility to watch and monitor and help that. So it's important to note, they don't just get away. Instead of being punished, they get treated. And so we'll talk about that in a bit. So there are 4 variations to the insanity defense: the McNaughton, the irresistible impulse, the substantial capacity, and the Durham defense. The Durham insanity defense. We'll look at each one individually, and we'll kind of break it down. So the first one, this is the one that even if you don't know the name, the McNaughton insanity defense, you probably have heard of this one before. This is the right-wrong test. It's the most common insanity defense in the United States. It's also the oldest, created in England in 1843, named after Daniel McNaughton. McNaughton was under the paranoid delusion that the Prime Minister of England, Sir Robert Peel at the time, was trying to kill him. When he tried to shoot Sir Peel from behind, he inadvertently shot Sir Peel's secretary, Edward Drummond, who thereafter died. McNaughton was put on trial for murder, and to the shock of the nation, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. After a public outcry at this verdict, the British House of Lords, which is their upper-level government, developed a test for insanity that remains relatively intact. So not a lot has actually changed from this. It was a fairly good test from a legal standpoint. So, very simply, the McNaughton insanity defense is cognitive, or it's related to the mind, the thought process, and focuses on the defendant's awareness rather than their ability to control their conduct. So the 2 elements that this requires is that the defendant must be suffering from a mental defect at the time that they committed a crime. Mental defect can be called a defect of reason or a disease of the mind, depending on the jurisdiction. They're both archaic, old terms that aren't socially friendly, but they do get to the point. So, number 1, there has to be a mental defect at the time of the crime. And second, the trier of fact must find that because of that defect, the defendant did not know either the nature and quality of the criminal act or that the act was inherently wrong. So there has to be a mental defect, and the person, the jury, the judge, whoever, needs to be able to say that because of that, they did not know what they were doing or that what they were doing is wrong. So, again, the terms defective reason or disease of the mind, like I said, there are very old, archaic definitions. They can be defined in different ways, but in general, the idea is that cognitively impaired to the level of not knowing the nature and quality of the criminal act or that the act is wrong. Common examples of this are psychosis, schizophrenia, and paranoia. Schizophrenia is the big one that we see show up a lot. It makes sense within the legal definitions, and that would be an individual who would not necessarily be guilty of their crime simply because they do not have the conscious ability, they do not have the mens rea of a criminal act. So, jurisdictions vary on the level of awareness the defendant must possess, so this is where things kind of get different. Some use know, some use understand, and others use appreciate. As an English teacher, let me tell you, the word choice matters. As a professor of criminal justice and by a marginal connection law, word choice matters. This is one of those things where, depending on how you phrase it, changes how you define it. And so having different terms in different locations means that you could be found guilty in one jurisdiction and innocent in another. So it's important to know the terminology. So if know or understand is a statement, all they have to do is a basic level of awareness. They know it. They understand it. Appreciate analyzes emotional state, and evidence of the defendant's character or personality would be relevant here. Appreciate has the connotation and idea connotation is a fancy English word for the undertones, the spiritual meaning, the implied understanding and meaning of a word. So it is implied that the word appreciate means that they not only know it, but they like it in some way, shape, or form. So they need to look at emotional state and say, well, they seem to be enjoying it. So, if this is what they do, then they do appreciate the crime. And so, yes. And that's why I say the word choice does matter. So, a defendant does not know the nature and quality of a criminal act if the defendant is completely oblivious to what they're doing. It's quite rare, so most defendants claiming insanity choose to assert that they did not know their act was wrong. However, and this is another one of those issues, jurisdictions differ on the meaning of wrong. So some jurisdictions define wrong as just legally wrong. Some define it as legally and morally wrong. Generally, the only instance where the defendant must be morally wrong, standing alone, is that the defendant claims that the conduct was performed at the command of God, which is a deific defense, which just means it's a defense based off of the belief that a spiritual guidance is what led you to this thing. This is the I drowned my children because God told me that that's how they're saved, that kind of thing. Anyway, whether the standard is legally wrong or morally wrong, if there's any evidence of a cover-up or an attempt to hide or escape, it is apparent that the defendant knew the difference between right and wrong, and thus the insanity under McNaughton is not proven. So that's the big piece there. If there's any evidence of a cover-up or an attempt to hide or escape, it's apparent that they knew the difference between right and wrong. Excuse me. So, oh, look at that. I can't believe it. Andrea, diagnosed schizophrenic, drowns 5 of her young children in the bathtub. She tells them that her children are dead. The operator dispatches, claims she's not guilty. Specifically, she had schizophrenia. That kind of thing. So, yeah, McNaughton is the big one that most people are familiar with because it's do you know the difference between right and wrong? And so each type that we look at has a chart like this where to point how it would be a non-guilty verdict for that particular part of the insanity defense. You have a mental disease or defect of the mind and an inability to know the nature or quality of the criminal act or that the criminal act was wrong. So now we talk about irresistible impulse. And this is the other one that people tend to know as well, even if they don't know the term. It's lost a lot of popularity over the years, and most states and even the federal government don't really follow this one anymore because it's easier to prove than McNaughton, and it's seen as an easy way out. So in some cases, irresistible impulse insanity defense is easier to prove, resulting in acquittal. So irresistible impulse should make sense, but irresistible, you cannot avoid, you cannot go against it. Impulse, we all have impulses. We know about impulse purchases. We know about, when we decide to do something just because we wanted to. That's impulse. So the irresistible impulse insanity defense supplements McNaughton. It goes with it. It's on top. So the focus is on the defendant's awareness, their cognitive ability, and the defendant's will, the ability to control conduct. So, typically, the defendant must suffer from a mental defect or disease of the mind, very much the same. However, the second element adds the concept of volition or free choice. If the defendant cannot control their conduct because of the mental defect or disease, the defendant's conduct is excused even if the defendant understands it's wrong. That's the piece that's different. So McNaughton, you have to be able to show that you didn't know it was right or wrong or you didn't understand the scope of it. With the irresistible impulse, you can know it's wrong. The problem is you couldn't control yourself. You still did it. And so this is where it gets a little confusing. So the challenge for the trier of fact in this kind of situation is distinguishing between conduct that can be controlled and cannot be controlled. So, typically speaking, how do you prove someone has control or does not have control? So the example that they give, inappropriate irresistibility And do they have... Okay. So Jolene, who has been diagnosed with paranoia, decides she must cut off all of her sorority sisters' hair because they are out to get her. She comes in with a taser and scissors. Her plan is to subdue everyone with a stun gun and then hack their hair off. So as she arrives, she sees Agnes, one of her sorority sisters, trip and fall in the parking lot, ripping her cashmere sweater and scraping her chin. Feeling a stab of pity, Jolene ignores Agnes and walks hurriedly toward the building. As she enters, Ashley, another sorority sister, turns, scowls at Jolene and barks, "What in the world are you wearing? You look like you just rolled out of bed." Jolene pulls a stun gun out of her backpack and shoots Ashley. While Ashley's lying on the floor, and Jolene takes out the scissors and cuts Ashley's hair off at the scalp. Jolene claims she is not guilty for assault and battery because of Ashley because reason of insanity. If Jolene attacked Ashley in a jurisdiction that recognizes irresistible impulse, she probably would not be successful with her claim. While she has been diagnosed with paranoia, that part's true, but Jolene seems aware that shooting someone with a stun gun and cutting off their hair is wrong because she spared Agnes based on pity. That's the piece. She noticed that was wrong. In addition, choice not to attack Agnes indicates she was in control of her conduct. If she really was an irresistible impulse, even though she was on the ground, she still would have cut her hair at the very least. So, yes, this is what we're talking about. I didn't mean to pull up the side of my PDF thing. So, third type is the substantial capacity test. And so this is an insanity defense created from the model penal code. So this is very legalese. So it's also called the model penal code or ALI defense. So the model penal code defense. Anyway, in 1982, John Hinckley successfully claimed insanity using the substantial capacity test in his federal trial for the attempted murder of then President Ronald Reagan. So if you have been alive long enough to know about this, or you're just interested in that kind of facts, you might be familiar with this case, but they use the substantial capacity test. Anyway, public indignation at this not guilty verdict caused many states and federal governments to switch from the substantial capacity test to the more rigorous McNaughton standard. So jurisdictions that switched to McNaughton also shifted the burden of proving insanity to the defendant rather than the prosecution. Wow, I couldn't think of that word for a second. So, the substantial capacity test reads as follows from the model penal code. A person is not responsible for criminal conduct if at the time of such conduct as a result of mental disorder or defect, they lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality, the wrongfulness, of their conduct or to conform their conduct to the requirements of law. So notice, there's two elements to this. First, the defendant has to have a mental disease or defect like the other two before it, but the second combines cognitive standard with volition, like the irresistible impulse defense. So it's easy to establish this one because both the cognitive and volition requirements are scaled down to be more flexible, and that's a key piece. So McNaughton is the one that most people are familiar with because it's the most rigorous. It's the one that's still used today. It's very much, how do you prove insanity? You have to prove without a shadow of a doubt. The irresistible impulse, it's like adding another thing to the McNaughton to look at, well, maybe not all the pieces of McNaughton fit there, but with the irresistible impulse, we see clearly, yes, this is there. This one, substantial capacity, is very much like, let's take McNaughton and just scale it down to be really, really flexible and easy. So it relaxes the requirement for complete inability to understand or know the difference between right and wrong. So they have to lack substantial, not total capacity. The wrong in the substantial capacity test is criminality, which is legal rather than moral. So they just broke the law. They didn't break a moral law. And unlike the irresistible impulse defense, the defendant must lack substantial, not total ability. So they can have ability, but in that moment they couldn't control themselves. And the use of the word appreciate rather than know is here. So as stated previously, appreciate incorporates an emotional quality, which means Evidence of the defendant's character or personality is relevant and most likely admissible. So this is the issue with substantial capacity. And so there is an example here, and I wanted to break it down. So the short early part, Lorene has been diagnosed with psychosis and spent most of her life in a mental hospital. While at the hospital, Lorene made friends with many of the patients and healthcare professionals. From time to time, she would play jokes on friends. Many of these, quote, jokes consisted of putting her antidepressants into their food. She was reprimanded and sternly punished for those, and always. And after she was released at age 21, she falls in love with Aiden, a man who works at a bookstore near her apartment. She decides to make Aiden fall in love with her by feeding him a magic potion, which she concocts out of a mixture of her antidepressants. She buys a book from Aiden and casually asks if he would like her to buy him a coffee. Shrugs and says, sure, but I don't have a break for another 2 hours. She offers to bring him coffee. Before bringing the drink to Aiden, she puts her magic potion in it. While Aiden is sipping the coffee, Lorene decides to declare her love for him. She then states, I know I shouldn't have, but I put a love potion in your coffee. I hope it doesn't hurt you. He becomes seriously ill after drinking the coffee and is hospitalized. So, to break down this issue, if she's in a jurisdiction that recognizes the substantial capacity test, she may be successful for her claim. So note, we have she has a mental disease or defect in psychosis, and her statement to Aiden indicates that she lacks the substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of the conduct. Note, if it was just the McNaughton jurisdiction, her statement of, I know I shouldn't have, is awareness that her conduct was wrong, and thus meaning it wouldn't be allowed. This is why the different levels make it possible. Lorene's behavior at the mental hospital indicates that she lacks substantial capacity to conform or control her conduct. Even after a lifetime of being punished over and over, she still does it. So this proves that she cannot control it, at least not fully. She does not have a substantial capacity to follow this. So, in this situation, testimony from her friends at the mental hospital may be admissible to support her claim of insanity and her lack of ability to appreciate the criminality of her conduct. This is why this is a very leeway-esque claim and why it's not adopted pretty much anymore. It's because it's too easy to prove. So all you need is mental disease and lack substantial capacity to appreciate that particular piece or conform conduct to the law. And then we get into our last one, the Durham insanity defense. Only used in New Hampshire and has been the established insanity defense in New Hampshire since the 1800s. It's the Durham rule or the product test. It was by the Circuit Court of Appeals for D.C., in a particular case, Durham versus the U.S. Defense put forth in the case is followed. An accused is not criminally responsible if his unlawful act was the product of mental disease or mental defect. As you can tell, this is the lightest one. However, the court failed to give definitions for product, mental disease, or mental defect. Thus, the insanity defense is extremely difficult to apply, and the D.C. Circuit rejected it in 1972 in the case U.S. versus Bronner, which was later superseded by federal statute. So, in general, the Durham insanity defense relies on ordinary principles of proximate causation. We're going to explain that word here in a second, but first, the defendant must have a mental disease or defect. So these are the two elements. They need to have a mental disease. We have that. And second, the element has to do with causation. If the criminal conduct is caused by the mental disease or defect, conduct should be excused under these circumstances. So, very specifically, the language of the judicial opinion indicates an attempt to rely more on objective psychological standards rather than focusing on the defendant's subjective cognition. So, the two required elements for the Durham insanity defense is that the defendant must have a mental disease or defect, and that the element is causation. It is caused by the mental defect or disease. So what does proximate causation mean? Well, proximate means within the general area. So causation, we've already talked about. Causation is that something caused this to happen, led to this happening. So proximate causation means that there needs to be closely related. It may not be a one-to-one, but it's closely related. So things like paranoia would fit perfectly. So this one talks about a particular physical condition called walleye. It appears that she's looking to the side when she addresses people. And so if someone with paranoia thinks that, she's always looking to do something, obviously if she does something, it would be a problem. So notice instead of both, it's mental disease or defect of the mind causes criminal conduct. This is what leads to this. All right. So proving insanity, there's generally a presumption that the criminal defendants are sane just as they're innocent. So therefore, at the minimum, defendant claiming insanity must produce or provide evidence that rebutes this presumption. Some states require the prosecution to thereafter prove sanity beyond a reasonable doubt or preponderance of evidence. Post Hinckley, many states converted the insanity defense into an affirmative defense. So rather, the defense may also have the burden of persuading the trier of fact that they are insane to a preponderance of evidence. The federal government and some other states require the defendant to prove insanity by clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher standard than preponderance of evidence. Preponderance of evidence, looking at it, you could reasonably see how it's connected. Clear and convincing evidence is there is no middle ground on this. All right. Diminished capacity is not the same as the insanity defense. Diminished capacity is an imperfect failure of proof defense. So diminished capacity could reduce first-degree murder to second-degree murder or manslaughter if the defendant lacks the mental capacity to form the appropriate criminal intent for first-degree murder. So, little mini history lesson. In California, diminished capacity was abolished as affirmative defense after San Francisco Supervisor Dan White used it to successfully, in his trial, be acquitted for the murder of fellow supervisor Harvey Milk. If you don't know anything about that, I don't want to say interesting. It's a little depressing, but it is interesting. It's worth looking into. But anyway, a jury convicted White of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree premeditated murder after reviewing evidence that proved his diet of junk food, Twinkies, created a chemical imbalance in his brain. Let me read that sentence again and let that sit with you. A jury convicted White, Dan White, of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree premeditated murder after reviewing evidence that proved his diet of Twinkies created a chemical imbalance in his brain. Take it or leave it. This is why this diminished capacity is no longer allowed in California. In the aftermath of this highly publicized trial, California passed legislation eliminating the diminished capacity defense and limiting the admissibility of evidence of diminished capacity only to the sentencing proceedings. So it couldn't be used to get off of a crime. It could be to reduce sentencing. So in a very similar way to diminished capacity, there is syndrome defense. Syndrome defense is just, a syndrome that negates the requisite intent for a crime to function as a failure of proof defense. Boom. So some common examples of syndromes that the American Psychiatric Association recognizes in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, DSM-4, and this is something to note. As a note, we are currently on the DSM-5. I believe actually we're getting into the DSM-6, but it still stands that these disorders fall under this category. So even though we've moved up since, it's important to know antisocial personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and intermittent explosive disorder are still disorders that are under syndromes that would be used in a syndrome defense. So some common examples of syndromes identified but not recognized in the DSM are battered woman or battered wife syndrome, which we talked about earlier, as well as caffeine withdrawal. Technically, drug and alcohol dependence is in the DSM, but it gets weird when we talk about it legally. So I just wanted to mention that, some of these particular syndrome defenses do come from the modern DSM idea. So anyway, just want to put that out there. So we need to talk about mental competence to stand trial. So much like insanity, this is also different. Mental competence to stand trial, this idea, so the insanity defense pertains to the defendant's mental state when they commit a crime. If it's found that they're exonerated, but mental competence to stand trial is looking at the time when the trial takes place, not when the crime was committed. If the defendant is mentally incompetent to stand trial, the trial is delayed until the defendant regains competency. In general, a criminal defendant must be able to understand the charges against them and be able to assist in their defense. According to the Model Penal Code, no person who, as a result of mental disease or defect, lacks capacity to understand the proceedings against them or to assist in their own defense shall be tried, convicted, or sentenced for the commission of an offense so long as such incapacity endures. A defendant who is mentally incompetent at the time of the trial is subject to mental health treatment or even involuntary medication until competence is regained. That's important. The other side of this is guilty but mentally ill. So after Hinckley's attempted assassination of former President Ronald Reagan, guilty but mentally ill verdict. The defendant who is found guilty but is mentally ill, they're not acquitted, but punished and treated for mental health simultaneously. So they'll be in prison, but they will be receiving mental health work. So typically, guilty but mentally ill verdict is available only when the defendant fails to prove legal insanity and requires the defendant to prove mental illness at the time of the crime. So it's important to note that, yes, you can do the insanity defense, not succeed, and still get help. Anyway, disposition of the legally insane. The not guilty by reason of insanity verdict means that the defendant is absolved from criminal responsibility and devoid of any criminal record for the offense. However, it does not mean the defendant is free to return to society. Remember, I mentioned this way at the beginning of this section. A defendant who is found not guilty by reason of insanity is automatically committed to a treatment facility until there is a determination that mental health has been restored. According to Model Penal Code, when a defendant is acquitted on the grounds of mental disease or defect, excluding responsibility, the court shall order them to be committed to the custody of the Commissioner of Mental Hygiene, Public Health, to be placed in an appropriate institution for custody, care, and treatment. Now, of course, we have to talk about temporary insanity. So many states will also, and jurisdictions will also recognize temporary insanity, which doesn't differ in analysis from permanent insanity, except it's not a classic history of mental illness and continued. So in a place that recognizes temporary insanity, the elements of the state's insanity defense, no matter which one they choose, they have to be present at the time the crime was committed. But if they're found not guilty by reason of insanity and regain their mental competency at the time of prosecution, the defendant is released after verdict. They're not put into a mental institute. So a very famous example of this is from 1994, Lorena Bobbitt. If you are not familiar with this one, real quick, in Virginia in 1994, and this is just from the text, but if you're interested in this case, there's definitely something to be said. Lorena Bobbitt was tried for the crime of slicing off her husband's penis. She pleaded not guilty to malicious wounding by reason of insanity. She successfully established the irresistible impulse insanity defense by presenting evidence of years of spousal abuse, a forced abortion, and sexual assault on the night of the incident. After the jury returned the verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, Bobbitt was evaluated, deemed mentally competent, and released. That is a fair statement. So this is what we mean by temporary insanity, that at the time of the crime, they were not in the right space, irresistible impulse insanity defense, but as of being not guilty for insanity, she was evaluated and sound. Yeah, she was mentally fine now, it just at the time was not. So that was reason for insanity. Now we get to talk about infancy, intoxication, and ignorance, and mistake. So, just like we have a juvenile justice system, many states recognize the defense of infancy. Infancy is this idea that the defendant is not subject to criminal prosecution because they're too young to commit the crime. Obviously, the policy supporting this is the belief that juvenile defendants are too immature to form criminal intent. Obviously, there are some wider implications of this, and if you want to talk about that, take juvenile justice. We talk about a lot of that stuff, but I will bring up a case that I talk about in juvenile justice here in just a second. So the Model Penal Code says a person shall not be tried for or convicted of an offense if a, at the time of the conduct charged to constitute the offense, they were less than 16 years of age, in which case the juvenile court shall have exclusive jurisdiction. And this is the other thing. The primary purpose of a juvenile court adjudication is rehabilitation. Goals to reform so that they can become a successful adult. This is an important aspect of our modern criminal justice system. The adult system looks to punish. The juvenile justice system looks to rehabilitate. Technically speaking, our own larger criminal justice system is trying to swing towards more rehabilitation. It did for a bit. We're a swinging pendulum. But not able to form criminal intent. This is where things get a little weird, and we will talk about it. So, juveniles can be prosecuted as adults under certain specified circumstances. Those under the age, at early common law point, and this is just a little history part, those under the age of 7 were deemed incapable of forming criminal intent and could not be criminally prosecuted. Between the ages of 7 and 14 were provided a rebutable presumption that they lacked the mental capacity, and then once they were 14, they were subject to adult criminal prosecution. Modern statutes codify the adult criminal prosecution standard for different age groups. Some states follow early common law, but other states set forth a minimum age, 14, 16, whatever, and once they reach that age, they are prosecuted as adults. But going back, they can be prosecuted as adults under specified circumstances. One of those is murder, and we'll talk about that. So when a juvenile court has jurisdiction, it must be forfeited to the juvenile is to be prosecuted as an adult. When a juvenile court has jurisdiction, the jurisdiction must be forfeited if the juvenile is to be prosecuted as an adult. Process is called a waiver. Juvenile courts can have exclusive jurisdiction over minors under 18 or concurrent or simultaneous jurisdiction with adult courts, depending on the state. So, in particular, and what I want to talk about here is a situation where they can be tried as an adult. So, there are several cases where a child who would be technically an infant, not infant as in like a child, baby, but under the infancy defense, they were too young to know right from wrong. But there are also cases where young, prepubescent, and teenage individuals plan and willfully attack. So the one I think of is the Slender Man girls trial. Something to note about juvenile justice and the juvenile justice system, and I want to just make this very clear. One particular piece of a juvenile being tried is that one of the requirements is that they cannot be without parole. They have to, whatever sentence, they have to have the option to have parole. Because remember, rehabilitation is the goal. Anyway, moving on. Intoxication. Intoxication can be use of alcohol, legal drugs, or illegal drugs. Model Penal Code says a disturbance of mental or physical capacities resulting from the introduction of substances into the body. Intoxication is a state that is achieved either voluntarily or involuntarily, and this is the big distinction. Most states frown on the use of voluntary intoxication as a defense and allow it only to reduce severity of a crime charged. Conduct that occurs after voluntary intoxication is probably not excused unless the intoxication prevents the defendant from forming the criminal intent. And this is where it gets funky. If the crime charged is a reckless intent crime, voluntary intoxication rarely provides even an imperfect defense. So, reckless intent crimes, no matter how much you are intoxicated, you're not going to get away with it. You're going to have a reduced sentence. So involuntary intoxication is more likely to provide a defense than voluntary intoxication. Generally, a defendant can claim involuntary intoxication if he or she ingested the drug or alcohol unknowingly or under forced duress or fraud. So, going back to all the elements we've talked about before, involuntary intoxication probably would affect your ability to come up with intent. Probably mess in some way with the act itself. And realistically speaking, it could get a reduced sentence or even a acquittal. So, involuntary intoxication could affect the defendant's ability to form criminal intent, negating specific intent, dropping murder a degree, or converting murder to manslaughter. Model Penal Code equates involuntary intoxication with the substantial capacity test. Intoxication which is not self-induced is an affirmative defense if by reason of such intoxication the actor at the time of their conduct lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or to conform their conduct to the requirements of law. In other words, and just what I said already, technically speaking, involuntary intoxication, where you did not do it yourself, at the time of that conduct, you may not have had the ability to appreciate the criminality or to work within the confines of the law. So, intoxication, typically involuntary, not voluntary. Ignorance and mistake. Occasionally, mistakes that we make negates criminal intent, and that's kind of important. The reality is things happen. So when we talk about mistakes in criminal intent and criminal law, we're talking mistakes of law and mistakes of fact. And obviously, I'm hoping that it makes sense when we talk about it. We'll talk about ignorance in a little bit. But mistake of law, the defendant believes their criminal conduct is legal. This is important. Mistake of law is that not a mistake of fact, mistake of law. You believed that the law said one thing and that you were wrong. So, Model Penal Code. Ignorance or mistake as to a matter of fact or law is a defense if the ignorance or mistake negatives the purpose, knowledge, belief, recklessness, or negligence required to establish a material element of the offense, or the law provides that the state of mind established by such ignorance or mistake constitute a defense. Typically, most states require, note I underlined this, the mistake of law be founded on a statute or judicial decision that is later overturned. Again, Model Penal Code. A belief that conduct does not legally constitute an offense is a defense to a prosecution that for that offense based upon such conduct when the actor acts in reasonable reliance upon an official statement of the law afterwards determined to be invalid contained in a statute or judicial decision. A mistake of law is not understanding the law, but it's not ignorance, and we'll talk about that. So I'm trying to take it step by step, and that's slowing this down. So incorrect advice from a licensed attorney cannot form the basis of a mistake of law defense, nor can a mistake of law be rooted in ignorance of the law. So this is where we get into ignorance. All individuals are required to know the criminal laws effective in their jurisdiction. Model Penal Code says a belief that conduct does not legally constitute an offense is a defense to prosecution for the offense based upon such conduct when the statute or other enactment defining the offense is not known to the actor and has not been published or otherwise made available prior to the conduct. Just because you don't know it's a law doesn't give you leeway. If you believe that the law is phrased a certain way and it's not, that's a mistake. Ignorance, not so much. So, example of mistake of law defense: shall be an attorney researches current case law and determines that it is legal to sell products over the internet and not charge sales tax. Starts selling designer clothing on eBay and does not charge her customers any sales tax. The case decision that Shelby relied on is overturned by a court of appeals. Shelby can probably assert mistake of law as a defense to the crime of evading payment of sales tax. The idea here is that the law itself that they were using has been overturned or has been changed in some reasonable way. So it's not knowing, it's knowing a previous form or not knowing the current form. That's really where this line comes in. Hopefully that makes sense. Mistake of fact, on the other hand, this is an easier one. If the fact, as the defendant believes them to be, negate the requisite intent for the crime at issue, the defendant can assert mistake of fact as a defense. It's generally not a defense for strict liability crimes because intent's not important. So, you can't say, well, I believe that I was going that. No, things like speeding is not covered under this. So, an example of mistake of fact defense: Mickey sees Rachel, his neighbor, riding bicycle in her driveway. Mickey walks quickly up to Rachel and demands that she get off the bike and return to the garage. Frightened, Rachel hops off and runs to her house, leaving the bike behind. Mickey walks the bike over to his garage. Once Mickey reaches the garage, she sees that his bike, which is an exact replica of Rachel's, is already inside. Mickey may be able to use a mistake of fact as a defense for theft. The intent for theft is the intent to take the property of another person. Mickey believed Rachel's bike was his, thus a mistake of fact is there. So it's not a law that changed, it's understanding of the facts or the situation itself. Again, speeding is generally a strict liability offense, so Tina's pulled over for speeding. Her speedometer is broke. She was mistaken as her speed. You can't say a mistake of fact because it's a strict liability case. So that's what we're talking about here. Remember, ignorance is not okay. Not knowing the full point is. All right, so let's talk about entrapment. So historically, no legal limit was placed on government's ability to induce individuals to commit crimes. Notice I have this underlined. The Constitution does not expressly prohibit this governmental action. Currently, however, all states and the federal government provide the defense of entrapment. So entrapment is just the government's use of inappropriately persuasive tactics when apprehending criminals. We typically know this with sex work and drug dealing, but we'll talk about it. So entrapment focuses on the origin of criminal intent, and that's the focus, and that's what should be the takeaway. If criminal intent originates with the government or law enforcement, the defendant is entrapped and can assert the defense. If the criminal intent originates with the defendant, then the defendant is acting independently and can be convicted of the offense. So the two tests for entrapment are subjective entrapment and objective entrapment. Federal government and the majority of the states recognize the subjective entrapment defense. Other states in the Model Penal Code have adopted objective entrapment defense. So going back to subjective versus objective. Objective is factual, subjective is personal understanding. And obviously we'll dig deeper into it here. So subjective entrapment is when law enforcement pressures a defendant to commit a crime against their own will. Subjective entrapment test focuses on the defendant's individual characteristics more than law enforcement's behavior. If the facts show that the defendant is predisposed to commit the crime without law enforcement pressure, they won't prevail. So, defendant's criminal record is admissible, it's relevant, past nature and crimes. If it's clear that the requisite intent for the offense originated with law enforcement, not the defendant, obviously they can say entrapment. So subjective is that personal side. So it's looking at the person who committed the crime. Do they have a predisposition to already commit this crime? If so, they can't say they were entrapped. And so the example here is really messed up, and I do want to talk about it, but an example of subjective entrapment. Winifred regularly attends Narcotics Anonymous NA for her heroin addiction. All the NA attendees know she's a dedicated member who's been clean for 10 years, and where Marcus, a law enforcement decoy, meets Winifred at one meeting and begs her to hook him up with heroin. She refuses, does this a couple more times. She finally feels pity because he was pleading with her, and says, after listening to Marcus explain his physical symptoms of withdrawal in detail, Winifred feels pity and promises to help Marcus out. She agrees to meet Marcus in 2 hours with the heroin. When she meets at the designated location, he arrests her for the sale of narcotics. She'd be able to assert entrapment as a defense if the state she was in recognizes subjective entrapment. Since she had not done drugs in 10 years and did not initiate contact, clearly the intent was not to sell heroin. And because she was a dedicated member, the other members at the meeting would be like, yeah, no, that she was there to maintain sobriety. She's been sober. Clearly, it shows that Marcus pressured Winifred to sell heroin against her natural predisposition, and entrapment would be there. Objective entrapment focuses on the behavior of law enforcement rather than the individual. So if law enforcement uses tactics that would make a reasonable law-abiding person commit the crime, the defendant successfully shows entrapment. So if any reasonable person would say, oh yeah, I would definitely do that if this was the situation, it's objective. So the objective entrapment defense focuses on a reasonable person, not the actual defendant. So their predisposition for crime is not relevant at all. Obviously, with that being said, their criminal record would not be there. So an example here, Winifred has a criminal record for prostitution. Law enforcement decoy offers Winifred $10,000 to engage in sexual intercourse. Winifred promptly accepts. If Winifred's jurisdiction recognizes objective entrapment defense, she may be able to successfully do this, because I'm just saying a reasonable law-abiding person could be tempted into committing prostitution for a substantial sum like $10,000. The objective entrapment defense focuses on law enforcement tactics rather than the predisposition of the defendant. So her record, not relevant. I'm just saying, if a law enforcement agent said, hey, $10,000 for you to sleep with me, I'm saying yes. Even if I don't, especially if I don't know that they are, I'd be like, 10,000 is a lot of money. I'll take that. So clearly a reasonable person feels the same way. So that's how that works. Well, that breaks it down. That is the second part of criminal defenses. It looked, again, just a reminder, we looked at particular insanity defense. We looked at unable mentally, whether due to age or alcohol, drugs, some kind of intoxication, as well as coercion and entrapment. That was the second half of this. Like I said, your second case study report focuses primarily on insanity plea. You're going to want to pay attention to that, looking into the McNaughton insanity defense. It's going to be relevant to that. But yeah, that was the notes. If you have any questions, like always, reach out to me, let me know, and hopefully I can answer those questions. But otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon.